Welcome back to the Tech Leaders Talk podcast, where experts and leaders discuss the industry and hard-earned career wisdom with your host, Barry Newkirk. Today's guest is Ted Lemcke. Ted is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and an Operation Desert Storm veteran. Ted has more than 30 years of experience with the Department of Defense and service-specific C4I systems, dating back to 1982, when he worked with a distributed command and control system at the U.S. Army High Technology Testbed. As Chief Technology Officer at IEM, Ted Lemcke provides leadership and strategic direction for all IEM business operations and for large, complex IEM projects. Ted has provided executive business management support for IEM's execution of the State of New York's $1 billion housing recovery program after Hurricane Sandy, and a $385 million contract with the State of Louisiana addressing recovery from their 2016 floods. Most recently, Ted oversaw a process automation project deployed in 10 different states addressing housing recovery from disasters, emergency rental assistance, and homeowner assistance fund programs. Ted holds a master's degree in environmental science and a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies.
I am very pleased to welcome Ted Lemcke. Ted is both a customer and a friend, and he currently serves as the CIO for a very large organization called IEM. Based in North Carolina. So Ted, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, Barry.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad to have you, and we're excited about the conversation today for sure. So Ted, as we typically love to start conversations like this with senior tech leaders around the country, tell us a little bit about how you grew up, some of the early influences in your life, and kind of your up through your education.
Yeah, I think I've got an interesting trajectory. As you can tell, I'm not the youngest guy in the room anymore, but it goes back to 1977 when I was a freshman at West Point. For my undergrad is really where my tech career, if you want to call it that, got started. And there was a core requirement to take a programming course your first semester. And the computer language was Fortran 77 in 1977. Obviously, quite a far cry from where we are today. Punch cards and trudging through the snow to go to the processing building to run your punch cards and get your calculations printed out on a big giant pin printer, but like I said, far cry from everything you can do on your smartphone today. But that was the start. It was my first exposure to computers or computing, and fortunately, West Point gives you a good grounding in tech. Proved it to me then, and today they still do with the Cadet Corps, and from that early indoctrination. In my first tour in the Army, I actually was assigned at Fort Lewis. I was a military intelligence officer, so there was a fair amount of tech involved in that over the years too. But I ended up in 9th Infantry Division in what they called the High Technology Testbed, which was one of the first attempts at distributed command and control using, at the time, VAX BMS. And I've had exposure to probably more languages and OSs over the years than many but that I think just makes you a little more rounded, in the tech field ultimately. But things were still done a lot differently then than they are now, obviously. But so that was just really the exposure to the use of tech to do the job better, communicate more effectively. I've always been the kind of person, even at a young age, that I just don't like to do things twice. I've got to do them a third, then I'm really disappointed, in a manual fashion, right? So I guess I kind of gravitated to computing, which is the enemy of redundant work, right? It's the expert at redundant work, really, but it's the enemy of you having to do it with your hands. So that's a good thing. And I think the Army and the Air Force at the time, this is in the 80s, early 80s, we're very much tech leaders. I had an assignment in the Air Force strategic job after that Fort Lewis engagement, where some of the first 286 PCs were actually in use, purchased by the Air Force. They've always been a big lead adopter, as you probably know, and definitely using those computers and other things. I was also in the strategic imagery interpretation field, and so there was a lot of very highly specialized um, computing equipment to do things with imagery interpretation at the national level. Things way ahead of their time, and the collection platforms that existed at the time that were way ahead of their time, and having the exposure to them, dealing with the data, the processing, the visualization, definitely had me solidly entrenched by the time I finished up my military career. I went off to grad school and had designs of increasing my tech exposure with environmental work. Got my master's degree in environmental toxicology, but ended up coming while in grad school. I was literally a student worker. I got a job with IEM, and that was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at the time. Went to LSU for my grad degree. And it was interesting because the founder of the company, still my boss, the dude Barrywall, had had a vision of bringing tech into emergency management. Remember at the time this was still at this point in the early 90s. You're talking about a discipline, emergency management, where a lot of people, the big mission was counting sandbags and water bottles, and they'd never even touched a computer. I remember we used to do some computer training back in those days, and we had people come in. We're trying to teach them some basic, computer things on to use the system that the Army had picked for this program. On the computer, taking the mouse and holding it up in the air, like thinking that it was going to move the cursor, and really that was the baseline, right? And I'll get to probably touch on that point again as we talk, because it's an interesting one there too. But anyway, I gravitated to that, and it just so happened the company had landed their first large federal contract with the Army chemical demilitarization program, and there were some problems that were there for the solving using modeling and simulation, distributed computing, and several things that were newer to the world, and doing them at the complicated level that we ended up doing them was very much unique to the world at the time. And we were able to solve some really tough problems. And that's what I probably learned to enjoy most in my time in tech, is solving the tough problems for our customers in a management consulting role. And that can be on many threads, because tech means a lot of things, right? It's not just programming. It's not just database work and analytics, there's the whole hardware aspect of tech too, right? So, but the more exposure do you get to a broad base across those things, I think the more you can understand the role that tech really has. It's not the magic bean, but it can very much be an enabler and a combat multiplier, if you will, using the military term, for getting your job done and delivering better, more consistent results for your clientele as well. And I guess the one thing that is my take home from it all is it's an evolution, right? It's the only thing consistent with tech is change, and today it's even more rapid change. It's just it's the constant, and what I'm doing nowadays is very different than where I started in that story. And our big ticket items we look at today in terms of moving IEM and the work we do for our customers with the tech we use or are developing. Now we talk about AI and low code solutions, blockchain, cloud engineered solutions, containerized and otherwise. And that's a big leap from just even pounding away on your basic PC years ago. But I saw a lot of it. It's I used Windows when it first came out. I remember staying up at night late with one of our tech people at IEM on the Unix box in the little server room we had and waited for the World Wide Web to launch at
Wow.
1 second after midnight, whatever date that was. I don't remember off the top of my head, but literally, was there. So those kinds of things are exciting to me. I think it comes from a lot of my experience and touching so many aspects of tech over the years. Kind of gets in your blood.
Let me take you back. So you kind of started at West Point. I want to hear about young Ted and how you really grew up before you got to West Point.
I guess I was always an achiever, and I fortunately could get good grades and tested well and do all those things in school that can open up paths. And I was big in sports, played a lot of different sports. Basketball was probably my big one, but I was captain of the basketball team. I was I was on the cross country team. I was on the tennis team. I was, did a lot of different things that were both leadership oriented, I guess, in a way, and collaborative, team oriented. And when I got ready to start looking at schools, I toured a lot of them, like many do. My junior year of high school, and West Point and the Naval Academy were two potential choices, and I went through the whole interview process for all that. But I was thinking about going to do something in the military from the time I was about 9 or 10 years old. No particular reason for that. I had no military history in my family, either side, and going back, and it just was something. I remember the one thing. I was a reader, big book reader, and I joined using my own money back then. Came from things like paper routes. I joined a thing called the Military Book Club. And each month I'd get I don't remember, it was 1 or 2 books, right? And I remember some of the titles even today. Two Ocean War was one of them, and books about B-17s, and obviously, a lot of World War II coverage, and but Vietnam too, and having grown up in that era of seeing it on TV and such when I was a young kid.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know what got me that interested in the military, but I always had at the back of my mind I was going to go that route, and hence the final decision, of West Point or Annapolis, because I got appointments that would have allowed me to go to either, and I just decided I didn't want to, float the oceans. I wanted to do things on the ground, so that's what took me to West Point. But I guess I was kind of geared to go there in my own head. No one was particularly pushing me one way or the other, but that's how I ended up going the route that I did and getting there.
All right, so I'm a basketball guy, so I want to ask you about your basketball, because I kind of figured, having met you in person, that you're probably a basketball player back in the day. So what was your position?
I actually played center at 6'2", but it was because I could out jump 6'8" guys. I had my vertical jump was awesome in those days.
Wow.
And it was pretty funny because we had a couple of guys played forward on my team that were 4, 5, 6 inches taller than me.
Yeah.
And I'd line up center, and the other team coaches would look at me and it's like, what's going on here? Like some kind of strange way of approaching the toss.
You talked about West Point and kind of you had to take a programming class or tech class in 1977. What was it that kind of like flipped the switch for you? It sounds like that was an origin point for you, Ted. So was it the professor? Was it the subject matter? I mean, did something come on? Did you get something to work, or were you confounded by a certain problem?
Well, then it was probably the subject matter. I had not, back then when you're in junior high and high school, it isn't like today where you've got all this Internet of Things and all the mobile interfaces and the gaming and on and on and on. Like I have a 17-year-old son, and have watched his trajectory in tech based on what he's walking around in the house in his hand.
Right.
That's basically so far different than it was for me. So without that indoctrination, early indoctrination, even available to me, it would have been the exposure to, say, Fortran, writing a program, seeing a result. It was interesting. Obviously, the military academies, all of them are very math heavy in their curriculum, and the freshman year in particular. So it kind of goes together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there were opportunities to do some projects and things, taking advantage of stuff they had at the academy that many other undergrad programs wouldn't have had access to. Which, but also a couple of really strong professors, particularly in some of those project areas. Like I remember taking a course later, and I think I was a junior then, called Weapon Systems Engineering, and got to do a really cool project with, looking at weapons design and such. So that, but the professor was a person that was really involved, and he kind of drew you in because of his, not just his personality, but he could express genuine interest in what you were doing too. And I think I've always responded well to that.
Hmm.
And that probably got me started. But I think where I really turned the corner and just became, lifelong. The rest of my military active duty time, hey, well, you're doing the mission and you're using tech to do the mission, and that's what's going to be, right? But
Right.
when I went to grad school and I started working, and we started doing some of these very unique projects I mentioned earlier, which are this chemical demilitarization program, actually solving problems, saved the Army hundreds of millions of dollars, that 3 national labs basically told the sponsor, the contract owner at the time, could not be done. And, I led the team that went out and did it. And that was a huge level of satisfaction, professionally and personally, came from that, and for the whole team. And it had legs for a decade or more. They were
Wow.
using these tools we built to do these kinds of problems that this risk assessment type technology was designed to solve. And whenever somebody tells you it can't be done, just like in sports or other endeavors, it kind of motivates you to disprove
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
And there's an immense satisfaction that comes from that. And the one thing about tech, I think, for any aspiring technical person is, it offers more opportunities for that, for you to achieve that kind of a feeling. I honestly believe it does. It's more than just winning. It's a lot of times it's doing something that's never been done before,
Yeah.
and that's always a good motivator for me.
Yeah. Absolutely. So how long were you in the Army active duty, Ted?
I did not do a career. I spent 11 years and got out for a number of reasons, and one of them being that the Army was not going to, or my branch was not going to send me to grad school, and I wanted to go. So, and I also was interested. I mentioned an environmental type career. I
Mm-hmm.
guess I thought I was going to go out and do great things for, um, for environmental quality somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and that's interesting how you think and how it turns out. But
Yeah.
that's anyway. That's one of the reasons I got out and went to grad school right out of right off active duty. I was in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So I had my war. I had a company command on a big company right after that. All the fun things you kind of do, if you will, in the Army, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then a lot of years of staff work to look forward to after that. And you just line up the cards and decide, hey, I'm going to make a change, and drive that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I was in the military, as we talked about before, and now that you say that, I had the I was an enlisted guy, but I had the privilege of working with a lot of officers. And there's a major who's the XO of our company, second in command of our, not our company, our brigade. And he was from South Carolina. And so he and I became friends as much as an E4 and a light colonel can be. And, he had just crossed over that 16-year mark, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to ride this out for another 4 years. But, making that shift at about the 10 or 11 or 12-year mark, I saw a lot of people, both enlisted and officer, having to make those hard decisions. So kudos to you for deciding your path instead of letting somebody else decide it for you. That's good.
Oh, believe me, I had plenty of people telling me I was doing the wrong thing, right? 20 years and you get a retirement, and it's it's only 9 more. I think it was 11 years and 7 months is what I did as active duty. And, parents and, friends and others, and even some mentor types, at least from the Army phase, right? But, the one thing I've always been, I guess my mom raised me to be independent and make my own decisions and make my own way. And I did it, from an early age, just deciding to go off to West Point. I was still 17.
Yeah.
When I entered, you've got to make those decisions yourself. And, once made, I never looked back, and great foundation, would never cast any aspersions on my West Point time, my Army time.
Sure.
But when it was time to change, it was time to change. So, made the change.
So speaking of change, so you went to LSU, you got your master's, environmental toxicology. You mentioned, did I hear that right, that you went to work at IEM very quickly after that?
I went to work literally as a graduate student at IEM. Still in my I was in the second semester of my first year.
Okay.
And of the program. And at the time, one of the reasons I went to work is that graduate school didn't give me enough to do. And, in the military, you can go. A lot of times you sit around and wait. But I was used to working long days and 6-7 days a week, and it just was kind of at that age I was still energetic and ready to do it. And then you hit grad school, and it's sort of like, this is too slow for me. So I decided second semester I had to get a job. So I actually got hooked up with IEM via another employee at the time. Company was, I think, only 15 people at that time.
Oh my gosh.
And my major professor happened to know this guy and made the connection. So I went to interview, and I probably wasn't the standard interviewee for Madu coming in to that. I remember that day I had my suit on, and everyone, and I come into the place and everybody's in t-shirts and Birkenstocks, and median age of 22. And here's this 32-year-old guy, walks in the door. And so it kind of even surprised her. She tells that story to a lot of people, and I can kind of see where she was going. But it was a kind of an instant match. And I actually started out part-time. And I think within 2 months, I was full-time. And I decided I could carry the load and the school load at the same time.
Yeah.
That's what I did.
Yeah. It's interesting. So a couple of things there. One of the themes that we've heard from multiple people that we've talked to, Ted, is relationships. So you had a professor who connected you with somebody, and then, independent thinker, and, speed at which you work, the cadence. I remember when I got out of the military, I was like, 40 hours a week? Are you really? This is like half stepping, man. It's like, come on, because I was used to working six days a week, 6.5 days a week myself. So I get that part. So how long have you been with IEM then?
1993, March of 93 is when I joined as that student worker. So, but yeah, it goes that far back.
And
it's
so you
going
said
on
when you
30
joined,
years.
Yeah, I was going to say next year it'd be 30 years. So you started with about 15 people in the company. How many folks are at IEM today?
We're pushing 1,100 now, and still growing. I mean, we could foreseeably in the next year's contract work, we could double that number again.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
it's
amazing.
pretty all organic growth. So, and I guess I'm a builder too, at heart. I used to, like, going back again when you asked me, well, what made you tick as a kid? I was a tinkerer, and I
Mm.
built models, like model ships and stuff like,
Mm-hmm.
and
Sure.
planes. And then as I got a little older, I like to work on car motors and just, building and fixing. But I've always liked to build stuff kind of from the ground up. And then you get a chance to do that um, with with an organization,
Yeah.
starting with just the smallest of teams, and then you end up, managing a set of teams, and then you can become a director of a bunch of those managers, and
Sure.
a typical organizational trajectory. But for me, always on the tech side. So at one point in my IEM career, I was technical director. I had the five managers that had software modeling and science people under them. Were all under me, and then it was VP of IT and systems engineering, and then I even did a stint as the chief operating officer for a while. But just a lot of opportunity moving around in the organization. But even though the tech core was always there, I think that that really helps if you can do that in an organization, because the more jobs you have, the more exposure you get, even to the people, doing maybe
Yeah.
work well outside your lane or your normal lane is all good experience. It rounds you and makes you better able to deliver at a higher scale.
I think a lot of CIOs around the country have really been exposed in the last 2 or 3 years, partly due to the pandemic, partly due to the economy of touching more things outside the stovepipe of technology. And I think that's enhanced a lot of careers and a lot of opportunities for folks in companies large and small.
Yeah.
So the ability to kind of grow and shift and move as your organization at IEM has grown is, I'm sure, been great for the organization in your service there, but also great for you as far as your learning and understanding how things are moving and how the business really works, which sometimes tech folks don't always understand really how business really works. Just understand the tech. So kudos to you again on that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the challenges for the CIO shop in particular, is being seen as relevant in the business conversation, right?
Yep.
And at least what I read and the ones I talk to these days, that there is a shift that has been occurring,
Mm-hmm.
and even a little more acceptance by the core C staff, if you will, um, you know, to bring the CIO, CTO, more into the operational conversation, because they have to, given the info security and cyber threat and
Oh,
all kinds of
yeah.
other reasons. But and even the IT modernization initiatives, where if you're really doing migration to the cloud, that's a business investment, absolutely, because of the cost, but
Mm-hmm.
you ultimately save, right? Over time, you're going to save a lot of that money, and now you become relevant in the business conversation, partly because you're the only one that really knows what that stuff is, and hopefully you can explain it in a non-technical terms.
Right.
But you definitely get drawn into the business conversation because the dollar amounts get big enough for that, and I think that's helped. Of those various factors have probably helped with that. But
Yeah.
there's
Well,
there seems to be some excitement about that better partnering. At least my circles of folks I talk with.
yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think now technology is getting closer and closer to the same footing that finance has. I mean, you can't do things without money one way or the other. And
Mm-hmm.
now you can't do things without tech one way or the other. Let's switch gears for a second. You mentioned your mom, you mentioned a professor. Tell me about some of your mentors, some of your influences when you were growing up, Ted.
I think they tended to be before college. They were probably coaches.
Mm-hmm.
I had good ones and bad ones, actually. But the good ones, were the ones that showed interest in you as a person and an athlete. They were engaged, and then they would try to coach and teach, but I guess do it in a way that wasn't like sitting on your grandfather's knee and having them tell you how it was in the old days. So
Right.
there's a different kind of messaging that has always attracted me, but and those were shorter lived mentoring engagements, obviously, because you move through school pretty quick, and then it's done, and you move on. Once I got to West Point, there were a couple of these professors, and I would say in graduate school, no different. So in the academic time, it was the professors that were engaged with me in a similar way, showed interest in something I was interested in, not just there to feel like they had to put their hour in and see you next week. So, and I've always responded pretty negatively to those kinds of folks in the academic world, but that's me. Everybody may be a little different there, but in the military, it's pretty easy. You'll have some officers, senior officers, that are just true role models, and you tend to fall in behind them, and you listen and you learn a lot. You keep your mouth shut more than you keep talking, and that you're going to get a lot more out of that. So I don't think there's anything particularly unique about those kinds of mentors, but and then I'd have to credit my ultimately my boss still today, Madhu, who, like I said, did a lot to help bring emergency management out of the Stone Age into use of technology as a standard, which is more the case today.
How did you ascend from a part-time worker at IEM as a grad student, quickly a full-time worker, to some of the leadership roles? How did those things happen? Can you tell us some stories, or tell us how Ted went from grad student, part-time guy to some of the cool things you've been able to do at the company now?
I think what I realized early, and it was probably just in my first year, literally at IEM, it's that we had a lot of smart people. We knew we had potential to do some really good products, but what was absent at the time, a brand new company, it was a small disadvantaged business, and entrepreneur just getting started out, a lot of factors common with a lot of companies today. There needed to be a task leader. And I guess my Army experience, definitely influenced the thinking there. But I basically kind of led the charge and said, we've got to have a little more structure and have a task lead. We actually established that right then and there as the term. We still use it today. But when I went to see the boss and kind of laid this out for her, she said, "So you're volunteering to be our first task lead then?" And I said, "Well, I don't. That's not why I came in to talk to you. But I guess if you need someone to do it, not that I wanted it, I can do it." I was confident I could. And it was to bring a lot of just basic, leadership principles in. Where I had to learn in the experience was how to adapt that to tech leader, because it's different. The people you deal with are different, quite honestly. They don't respond to command and control like a military model well at all, from my experience. And they're very bright, and they have a lot of independent thought. And there are egos, and then there are just simple. They want their voice heard.
Sure.
A spectrum probably of that, right? And so what I had to learn is how to deal in a leadership role with those things. But it helps, when you're working to solve a problem and you got your sleeves rolled up and you're working too. You can establish a little more credibility that way with the group. And once you're beyond just conversational with people, I think then you can start bringing in some of those principles, some of those things that even from the leadership training I'd had and experience I'd had implementing it in the military became more relevant. But I couldn't start out that way, because like I said, command and control does not work with tech people. So that's how it started. I guess I was the task lead, and at some point I became the trainer mentor of other task leads, and just built the foundation of that tech leader cadre in IEM as we grew, from the ground up. And that's important because as you scale, one of the first things that often fails is you don't have enough of those tech leaders in the organization. You get a whole lot more tech resources, and then your tech leader becomes, or few leaders become overloaded. And I've seen that happen in many organizations. So we did it right, I guess, from that perspective. And whether you just call it serendipity or it wasn't by design, that I just I was the one that led the charge at IEM, but that was kind of the start of it. And I think the other thing was really turned the corner was when your peer group of these technical people start pushing you forward for things like, you should go do this talk presentation, or it isn't just because they're trying to hide behind you, or they don't want to do it. It's like they think you're the best person to carry the water, and then you've turned a corner, you've got some ability to influence, and that helps a lot too.
How many folks are in the technology group at IEM now, Ted, roughly?
About 200, at roughly 20% of the workforce.
What's one of your proudest professional accomplishments so far?
Oh, I think it was the one I mentioned. It was we built this distributed simulation called QEM, Quantitative Emergency Management, which was an extremely complex set of tools, really, that would do what I'd like to call resource acquisition problems. It's, you have a program, you have X amount of funding, in other words, you don't have unlimited budget, and you're supposed to be protecting people. You can use a lot of different things to do that. People tend to jump to the material solutions, right, to buy stuff, in the context of the emergency management and the chemical stockpile emergency preparedness program, which was what actually funded this work. It was alert notification systems and detectors and shelter in place, in congregate shelter in place, positive pressure protection systems. Some of it using newer technologies and such. And so, but when, the mistake a lot of organizations make, public sector organizations in particular, is they jump right to buying stuff. Sure. And stuff tends to be the most expensive part of the solution. So in that limited budget, you burn the budget quickly buying stuff. Then the question is, the question we wanted to ask is, did the stuff make a difference? And because a lot of times it doesn't. And so we built this whole simulation tool set to go at that question specifically. But it was complex from the standpoint of started with using probabilistic risk assessment techniques from the nuclear industry. After 3 Mile Island, they were all required to do these, they're called PRAs, and very, very detailed engineering level probabilistic risk assessments. And out of that comes a threat deck, or I tend to refer to it as, but it's a big list of possible upsets that can happen with different degrees of consequences, with different probabilities. And then you have real weather in a place that can, which is obviously probabilistic. And then you've got the response of a population when something happens, which isn't when you send out an evacuation order or you turn the sirens on. You can't have the expectation everyone's just going to immediately get in their car, with all of, kids, dogs, and whatever else, and get on the road at the same time. It's really a set of overlapping distributions of things, right? So anyway, we codified all of that in a pretty novel way and produced a simulation result that would actually score in terms of the risk avoided, if you will. In this case, risk was fatality of a citizen, or a worker on these chemical activity locations. So part of it was so cool to build just because of what I described, and it was there wasn't anything out there to do that. And then the fact that our government sponsor told us after the fact, actually, that they had gone to 3 different national labs who heavily supported these programs in different ways as well, that they wanted something like this, and they had told them it's impossible, too many variables, too complicated. And so we just said, we can build this. And I got a team together who I guess I convinced we could build this, and we built it. And we worked, it was like one of those day and night projects. And you really, you just built a lot of bonding, a lot of camaraderie,
sure,
in getting to the technical result. And then some of the first results we had, to that client were revolutionary. And then we had to switch to, realizing that the soft post community, these were county emergency management agencies, and the baseline education level was probably not even high school graduate, right? And certainly not computer analytics savvy, people, right? And communicating those technical results to the non-technical audience then became the next step. And we probably spent at the end of several years of engagement with this, I would say we spent more time on the second thing than we did on building the tools in the first place. Really? But it absolutely was required, and that's why I'm a strong believer in the best rounded technical resource person has the ability to communicate technical stuff to a non-technical audience. Absolutely essential.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But that was what I was most proud of. We did it. It, like I said, had a 10 plus year run, and literally, not by our computation, by the Army's, saved hundreds of millions of dollars in program funds. That's not amazing. Spending stuff on frivolous protective stuff that wasn't going to make a difference, right? And that's I think that was my shining moment, was because I would go out and do all the presentations and stuff too, and you obviously I've got bias because you build a lot of ownership when you do that.
How big was your team to build that initial simulation? How many folks were on that group?
10 or 12 people. And it wasn't all just programmers. It was scientists. Like we had an atmospheric physicist for the transport and diffusion modeling. We had statistician. We had nuclear engineer because we needed somebody that knew that PRA world. And we actually had 2. But a number of the core developers were all C++ programmers.
And how long did it take you to build that simulation? You said it was day and night project.
3 months.
Yeah.
3 months.
I've been on several of those projects, and those are super fun projects. They're exhausting, but they're really fun. And you can build deep camaraderie if you have a good team and you have a clear mission. And, it's the closest thing to the military being on a sports team that I've ever experienced in a professional setting, is being on something like that, because you have a defined goal and it's almost like a campaign. You're just going after it. It doesn't matter, day or time or whatever. You just got to get it done. So that's cool. Yeah. What are your best guesses, Ted? I mean, you've seen a lot of things from your time at West Point up to and through today. What are your best guesses for where technology is going? What does the future of tech look like?
I say the future remains bright. It's like, think about it this way. 10 years ago, would you have contemplated a smart home system?
No.
Now a couple $100 and you implement a pretty good start, with the only interface being your smartphone, right? And an internet connection, of course. So tech is the only thing that could have gotten us there. There's so many examples. The big guy with the big examples: Google, Twitter, Facebook. All changed the way we live to a degree, right? And then Amazon. Oh my God, I think I must work for them as an honorary employee or something. I buy so much that way. But there's still a lot more to come, and there's disruptive change is not a bad thing. And if anybody thought so, I'd hold up any of those examples to say that they're wrong, right? And so what's exciting is as these things change, even if it's similar type of delivery or function, it may be done in a totally different way. So, I'm really looking forward to seeing holographic presentation, projectors, things of that nature. There's some of these things are not that far down the road, and once it gets in your blood, you can't wait to see them. And then I've always been one that wants to buy the first, iteration coming out too, and just to test it. And the advantage of, I guess, being in a larger company is in a position I can actually do that, on the company nickel sometimes, which which helps, right?
Yeah.
But with a legitimate use in mind for it, obviously. But I think we're going to be in good shape. Now you can look at little market reactions and things like these same big guys I mentioned laying off employees now and everything. A lot of that I think was COVID effect. They staffed up because of COVID and the demand that COVID produced in people staying home. And then COVID's over now. So for in people's minds, most people's minds, I think. So it's you're a business. At the end of the day, people have to understand that even with tech, there's still business implications.
Absolutely.
Some businesses making the tech that you're using or contemplating, and they have to stay in business, and many don't. But the ones that do are also at least mind the business store as well. So those things are going to happen, but the trajectory of tech and new tech is not going to be affected by that, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Things will go up and down. A company like ours can even look at some of these, kind of market effects as an advantage, right? There's a lot of good, and in your business, you probably see this too. There's going to be a lot of good talent on the street to go mine potentially, and I don't want to take away from people losing their jobs or anything, but hopefully they'll find good places to land because there's a lot of folks still looking.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good talent that's available, but there's also a lot of need. So that's a good thing. Let me ask you. You talked about being an avid reader, and obviously you're intentionally curious, and I respect that. What are you listening to? What are you reading now? What's informing Ted as he goes about his weekly schedule?
Yeah, honestly, I'm not a big podcast guy. And maybe it's just that I spend so much time in virtual meeting space that I can't get myself to go spend half hour watching the screen again.
Sure.
But I do read, and some of the recent tech books I could call out that I really think are awesome. Age of AI, Henry Kissinger, Schmidt, and Huttenlocher, if I pronounce that right. That's a tremendous book because it's you think about, these are some of the big thinkers of our time, really, and they go way back. Obviously, Henry Kissinger, for sure, and their perspective on coexistence with AI in the world today is a very unique one because it's not written by the guys trying to push the envelope with AI, the tech guys, that extreme tech people. These are more politically world events oriented people seeing, and so that's an interesting perspective. There's a book called Communicating with Data by Carl Alchin. It's all about how do you communicate to non-technical audience, the insights that come from data analytics. and I believe strongly, very strongly, and a lot of it goes back to that QEM thing, talking about how much time we spend on communication versus even just cranking the crank, right? But one of the most important things for a tech practitioner to learn is to do that effectively. You've got to be able to communicate to the non-technical audience and still paint an effective picture of what you're trying to tell them. So that book is really a lot about that. I've read a lot of other books like that over the years, like Visual Display of Quantitative Information is one of the Tufte. That's one of the iconic ones, right, from way back. But I would encourage anybody seeking a tech career, get that in their DNA as quick as possible, and then do read some of those kind of resources for that. And there's another one I recently picked up, hadn't even finished, is Everybody Wants to Rule the World by Ray Wang. And it's interesting, the Feldman, the city of Asheville CIO here in North Carolina, recommended that book strongly, and that's why I picked it up. But it seems to be a good play on where tech is going and how societally you have to match up.
I'll make sure that we get that in the show notes for our listeners to take a look at. And Ted, as we wrap up, how can we learn more about you and your work and IEM, the company?
First order would be our website. It's pretty comprehensive. We're constantly updating it. Matter of fact, we're going through another re-engineering of the IEM digital. That's what we call our tech arm. Right now that new content should be up there, not too distant future. But we do also participate in a lot of symposia and speaking engagements and things, the conferences, to include the tech ones. We've been spending a lot of time in the low-code circuit lately, and then our CEO Madhu spoke last year at the North Carolina Tech Women in Tech. She was the plenary speaker. We do a pretty good job on social media announcing these things ahead of time and such. So, and then LinkedIn, kind of awesome. Engagement with some of our leadership will post up there too. So if you follow a couple of our folks, or just keep an eye on those links, to those IEM media sites, it'll at least roadmap where some of these things are occurring. And then if there's interest, can always, a lot. And even today, a lot of those things you can attend remotely too. You don't have to go in person. So gives people a cost-effective way to keep up too.
Yeah, that's very true. It's a really cool feature that a lot of groups and organizations and meetings are incorporating nowadays, so it makes it accessible to everybody. So, well, Ted Lemcke, I greatly appreciate your time and your interest and all the insight and just great background that you've given our listeners today. So I just want to say from all of us here at Tech Leaders Talk Podcast, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Barry.
Thanks for joining us today on the Tech Leaders Talk Podcast. Until next time, Tech Leaders, keep talking.